Today at shopdap.com, we're going to be doing a vehicle inspection on a MK5 GTI. Okay, so today we're going to be doing a vehicle inspection on this vehicle. This could be done either one of two things. One, you just own one of these vehicles and you want to make sure that everything's in good shape. Or two, is it as a pre-purchase inspection. We always recommend getting those. I've recommended it many times before. Doing a pre-purchase inspection properly will prevent you from ending up jammed up with a car that has a bunch of problems and has a big headache. So making sure you do something along these lines is going to help you get there. It's not going to guarantee that you won't have any problems with the car, but making sure you do your due diligence to make sure the car is in proper working order is very important. So with that said, the levels of what you're going to do in this are going to vary. So we're going to go into a pretty in-depth explanation of this particular thing, something that you might expect to pay in a pre-purchase inspection. You also would have maybe a lighter version of this anytime you're taking your vehicle into either a repair shop, like we're going to be starting a shop. You bring your vehicle in for an oil change or any type of service like that. They're going to be looking at all those things kind of to go down the list, make sure everything's in proper working order. Now, they're not going to go super in-depth. Again, that's more along the lines of a pre-purchase inspection of something that would read a full overview of all control modules and all kinds of other things along with that. But this is important information to go on that. So let's start with getting underneath this car. All right, so here we are under a vehicle. And there's a lot to look at under here. So we're going to start by taking down this belly pan because this is going to give us full access to view the engine, and is kind of a requirement, and this is something that I generally always would recommend because this is going to help you determine if the vehicle does have any leaks of any kind, what those leaks are. Now you can also take a look at the belly pan. This will tell you whether there's any leaks. This just looks dirty and it's got cracked in one spot. This car is lowered, so that does make sense. Now, you can take a look along the bottom here and see if there's anything going on. I can tell you that there is some seepage here from what appears to be from this transmission case. There appears to be RTV on this transmission here, which means that this case was likely opened at some point and someone's been inside this transmission. Now, that's not 100%, but I would bet very likely if you look at the history, you'll find that. Now, this is not particularly bad, so I would say it's probably not too big of a deal if you were to let that go. If it's just seeping a little bit, and it's much better than removing the transmission and taking the case apart. The stuff you're going to be looking for, things like leaks, things like wear, things that are broken, things that are a problem. Now, part of the problem with this stuff is you actually have to know about cars and understand them to know what's going on and what it should look like versus what it does look like. First, let's start with the tires. All the tires should be inspected on the vehicle, noting tread depth and also the wear pattern. So you are going to want to make sure that the tread depth from this side of the tire to center of the tire to the outer side of the tire is even across there. You also can run your hand down the tire like this because you'll have what's called cupping or feathering. It's when you get uneven wear on the tire. This generally isn't necessarily an issue. Cupping will happen from either lack of tire rotations or alignment concerns. If you don't get your car aligned properly or get it taken care of, you could potentially have cupping on tires. It just results in noisiness of your vehicle while you're driving and isn't going to have any issues. But you can see here across this tire, this does seem pretty good. The wear is fairly even from inner to outer. Maybe a slight amount of wear on the inner side, which this vehicle's lowered, so it's possible some of that's just going to be camber wear because when you lower a vehicle, it does tend to camber a little bit. Okay, so here we are looking at the driver's side wheel. You can grab it and feel if there's any play there. If you have up and down play, then you would have issues with potentially either a ball joint if it's moving in and out, or if it's just a tire moving that kind of rotates, rocks back and forth, it's probably a wheel bearing problem. This one does not have either, but as you can see here, this is the tie rod here, and the boot is split, which means this tie rod eventually will become worn and you'll get play there. It currently does not have any play, but that is something that we will need to address in repairing this vehicle. Now, one also thing that you can note here is this CV boot is actually cracked. Now, normally on an outer CV boot, they'll crack somewhere along the outer edge here, which when that happens, when you turn, it opens up and just sprays CV boot grease everywhere. Usually it's very obvious when you have a bad CV boot on an outer one like this, because like I said, when it does open up when you're turning, it will spray grease everywhere. This one has a tiny bit of grease here around this split point here, and then some right here on the bottom of the strut and then the knuckle, but it's pretty minimal and something that it's splitting where the clamp is and where the boot meets the axle itself. This will eventually need to be replaced because you will eventually have more problems with losing grease, but for this purposes, I would not be worried about an axle being bad based on this information. Now, it's also important to note, when you're dealing with this type of circumstance, you will want to address this, because failing to fix a bad axle boot could result in all the grease being lost, and that would destroy your axle, meaning you have to replace the whole axle assembly. Replacing CV boots is not awesome, and it's a pretty dirty job, so it's not super fun either. Now, as I mentioned under there, just to clarify, when you're rocking side to side this way, if you have play, and again, that's assuming that the steering wheel is locked, what play is going to feel like is you're moving it, and there's play before anything in the steering rack is actually moving. So you'll get play this way, side to side, and that would be either outer or inner tie rod, or you can go like this and you'll get some play this way, and that's going to be generally wheel bearings. Now, if you can pull like this and you feel it shifting down here underneath on the ball joint here, that's a different story, and you can kind of pull in and out like this, and you'll see kind of some wiggling happening at that ball joint. But generally what you'll feel is either wheel bearings like this, although you'll often hear wheel bearing noise during a test drive, or side to side like this, which would be our tie rod. Now, this tie rod that we saw, the boot is actually cracked, but there's no play in it yet, which means there's no issue with it. Doesn't need to be replaced urgently, but eventually a popped boot like that or a cracked boot will potentially have a point where it starts to get play in it. Now we're going to take a look at some of our bushings here. Again, we had our ball joint that we looked at here. We have our inner control arm bushing for the front one here, and then our rear one here. Now, you can try to move them by hand. Usually you're only going to notice that they're real bad if they're basically non-existent, but you can see a little bit of wiggle there, and you can kind of wiggle them back and forth here, and you can see that there's not really any play there. And the same goes for over here. You can kind of wiggle that, and this would move quite a bit inside of this bushing if you were to have an issue. So we are good on our bushings on that control arm, and we can move on to some other things. We can give our sway bar a little shake here, and this will tell you that no movement is good. Everything is snug with that. Now, also one thing to note, this right here is the sensor for the xenon headlights. This is something that you have to be careful of when lowering your car, because oftentimes if you forget to disconnect this, you'll break it and they need to be replaced. This is something to be super careful of whenever you're working on any suspension on pretty much any Volkswagen or Audi model. We'll have this oftentimes in the front and sometimes in the rear as well. All right, now let's take a look at the engine itself. We took that down so that we could look for leaks. If we look across here, we mentioned this transmission leak earlier. Again, this looks like minor seepage, but it's something that you're going to want to keep an eye on. If we look over here, I can tell you that this has an oil leak of some kind. If you look here, this is all dry and doesn't look like much. This, you can see, is wet, and if you rub your finger across it, you'll get some oiliness and some oil and grime from there. So oil leaks always are obviously going to run down from the top of the engine. So what we're going to want to do is at some point take a look from here towards the upper part of the engine to try to determine where this leak is coming from. My guess is it's somewhere around the timing cover area here, which is going to be something that's probably going to be somewhat of a time-consuming oil leak to fix. It also could be coming from the cam cradle on TSI engines. They can leak from the cam cradle, which is basically what holds the camshafts in place and is the valve cover. Essentially, that's one piece that you have to remove the cover to replace, and it has anaerobic sealant on there. All right, so here we are under the vehicle. This is the front of the engine, and here's our radiator support here with our cooling fans. You can spin the fans just to make sure there's no major issues with them. You're not really gonna see much in terms of fan issues unless they're broken. You can take a look at all your pipes and cooling and everything else here. We have our AC lines, our cool. This is secondary water pump here, which circulates coolant after the vehicle's done running. All of our boost pipes and stuff like that. You can see kind of a little bit of a dirty mist there around the couplings. That's pretty normal. Now, what I want to point out is if you take a look right here on this hose, there's some white stuff. It's kind of chalky, and you can see if you look closely, I'm not sure how well this is going to come across on camera, but basically you can see how it kind of runs down from the pipe. Now what this is a remnants of a coolant leak. Now my guess is this coolant leak is not particularly bad, but it is there. So what we were going to want to do is determine where this is coming from. Now I can have a pretty likely bet that this is coming from the water pump assembly. Now the water pump on this vehicle is located slightly up and to the left of where this is. It's on the passenger side of the engine underneath the intake manifold, and that's likely where this is coming from. So if I'm correct, we'll be able to look kind of up in that direction and possibly see more of where this leak is coming from. Okay, so we got this camera positioned the best we possibly can, we believe, to see this leak. And so what you're looking at right here in the center is we're looking through, this is the secondary water pump here, we're looking through the two hoses in the middle, and we're looking straight up to that screw up there. You can see there's a torque screw. Now, above that torque screw, you're gonna see where my hand's going here, you can kind of see that there's white crustiness right in this area right here. Now that is a coolant leak. And what this is a flange that actually bolts to the water pump assembly. So we can see where we have our coolant leak coming from. Because of the failure proneness of these water pumps, we should be looking at replacing this. It is something to be aware of on this car, that we do have a water pump leaking, and we should look at replacing that at some point in the near future. Again, this is something that probably could go a little while without replacing it directly, but if you let it go for too long, you'll end up in a circumstance where the water pump will blow out and eventually a lot of coolant will leak out. Now, once we've checked all the other suspension components underneath, ball joints, control arms, tie rods, and all that stuff, let's take a look at our brakes. Again, caliper, carrier, pads, and then you have your rotor. Now these pads you are going to look at for the material. These are low on here. The inner pad will always wear faster than the outer pad. You can take a look through this slit here, through the caliper, to see the wear on the pad material there. You can take a look at the shocks and struts here. We have, this is a factory one. You can take a look and see logos here, and then you can see the factory part numbers here and here. These are lowered, these are springs on here that the vehicle is lowered. It actually is pretty low. I would suspect a couple things, just based on my experience, that the suspension potentially will make noise. Vehicles that have some age on them that are lowered tend to wear out strut bushings faster than factory suspension cars. They get beat up faster. So strut bushings and bearings will tend to make noise. If you have any knocking noises kind of coming from your upper suspension, usually a lot of times you might hear some popping during slow turning. That's pretty common for strut bushings or bearings to cause, generally bearings. And then you would have to drop your strut assembly to do so. You also at this point can check for leaks in the struts. It's not super common on Volkswagen Audi models, but you can take a lift up the dust boot here and kind of see if there's a lot of fluid here that would be coming out of the shocks. That means the seals are blown, and you would be looking at replacing shock assemblies. Now, that's not particularly common, and I didn't find any oil there, as I wouldn't expect to. All right, as we take a look at our rear wheel here, you will want to try to make sure the e-brake is off when you're up in the air like this, so you can spin it freely, make sure there's nothing dragging. You are going to hear some noise from the rotor and pad touching each other. That's very normal. You can kind of do the same deal where you rock it, much like we did the front, and side to side. You are going to be checking for wheel bearing. If there's any type of other play in here, it's going to be related to suspension bushings of some kind, at which point you can inspect underneath. But I don't really have any major play here, and you will want to check your tires for wear as well, just like the fronts. And again, much like we did with the front, we're going to take a look at our rotors, see what the wear looks like. If you have extreme pitting or sometimes really deep lips in here, that could be an indication that they're old rotors. These pads are pretty fresh. The rotors don't look too bad. They don't look awesome, but this is a car from a northern area where they get snow, which is, so you should expect to see kind of some surface rust on the edges there. It's gonna be very normal. We can't move our dust boot here out of the way. It is a hard plastic one. If you had an excessive leak coming from this, you would expect to see kind of some fluid running down here. And again, we have our aftermarket springs. And we can take a look over everything here. On this particular vehicle, we also can look underneath right here where we can actually find whether the fuel filter has been replaced. We can inspect it. We did recently just issued a DIY on that, which we'll link to in the description below. Now here we are under the hood of our car. Now the part of the reason why I like to go under the car first before going under the hood in an inspection like this is because you can see and identify things like leaks that we saw underneath that we can then try to inspect on the upper side of where they're coming from. Now obviously the coolant is a little bit low. It's not very low, but just a touch, and we did see that water pump leak. And we can pop off this engine cover just to see if we can find anything underneath here that's obvious on this vehicle. Now as I'm looking here, I'm looking all along the valve cover here to see if there's any leaks. These cam cradle valve covers do tend to leak there, and there's nothing really major there. Same thing along the back, we're going to do the same, and it does not appear to be coming from there either. We're going to be looking for any type of other oil leaks, and generally an oil leak is going to be kind of wet and then also have a bunch of dirt kind of clumped to the damp spots of where the oil is. And then you can kind of look down along everything. You can inspect your belts. You're not going to generally see much in terms of belts unless they're really destroyed. And then we can look down at our water pump assembly to see if we can locate any further leaks on this particular setup. You also want to make sure you check the oil to make sure the vehicle has oil in it. That will ensure that you have everything operating properly there. Now you can go on this side of the engine and take a look all along there for any leaks of any kind, although generally we would have seen them had they been there. Now we also can take a look up top at the transmission because we saw that leak kind of what seemed to be coming from where the housing meets. It's possible it's coming from another place. So if you take a look at the top of the transmission housing using a flashlight, you can take a look at that DSG filter that's located in the back. And it does not appear to be coming from that particular area. And it does not look like that is a particular concern. Now we have a high pressure fuel pump here. That is an original one. They do tend to go bad potentially. And we have this PCV valve on here, and this is an AC revision PCV valve. And on this particular car, they've been revised a couple times. So this is not the most current revision of that PCV valve. You can also take a look at, maybe inspect your battery, make sure the terminals don't have any major corrosion on them. They do have a tiny bit of corrosion here at the base. You can just clean that off with a wire brush and get that all squared away. You can pull off your brake fluid cap and just take a look at the condition. I can tell you this brake fluid doesn't look too terrible. Looks like it possibly would have been serviced at some point during the life of this vehicle because this vehicle does have some mileage on it. Now that we've looked at all the mechanical stuff, let's take a look at the outside real quickly. I'm not going to go into detail about nitpicking over anything on a car. That's something that you can do on your own. You don't need me to show you what to look at to make sure a car is in good condition. I would suggest making sure you look at things like bulbs, make sure everything operates. This car specifically has xenon headlights from the factory, so you will want to make sure that the bulbs work properly. Xenon bulbs and ballast are very expensive. We do have a DIY actually showing you how to replace that on Mark V headlights. But you will want to make sure you check over things like that, all the functionalities of all the lighting on the outside, turn signals, mirrors, the whole deal. Now, one thing I wanted to point out with this car is this car has been modified. You can take a look here and I can tell you that this has a non-factory grille. This is a Wolfsburg grille, and they do have non-factory fog grills and a center grille matching, because this would have been honeycomb from the factory and that these have been replaced with these. Now, I don't say that to say that this is bad. I'm only saying that as a way to notice whenever anything is not factored in a vehicle, it should perk up your ears to look for other things that may have been done and to make sure that they've been done properly along the way. Modifying cars can be done very cheaply if you don't do it the right way, or if you're doing it in a very quality way, it could be perfectly fine. They could be quality parts, either factory or potentially better, depending on what you're looking at. So I'm only saying this, take notice of things like this grille to make sure that you're looking along the way to make sure that everything's fine in terms of other modifications that may have been done on the vehicle. Okay, so here we are inside the vehicle. Now I don't want to go over every small detail about things to check because there's a million things you could check. You will want to check things like buttons and switches to make sure that they operate properly and that type of thing. Aesthetic things, make sure all your lights work, make sure all the seats move back and forth, make sure that you have no issues around things in the interior. I don't need to go over those details. I don't think they're necessarily important in this circumstance, but we will want to be inside the car to make sure that we're scanning the vehicle properly to ensure that there's no issues internally and stuff that we haven't caught with our visual inspection. So we have our OBDeleven plugged into the car. We have the key on in the ignition in the on position, OBDeleven in the OBD2 port, and we have our device here. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to hit the scan button. Now this is going to scan every control module in the vehicle to determine what is going on and what control modules will have faults in them. So let's go ahead and let it do that. Now that beep is going to be normal when it's checking through your ABS system. It will often make that noise. Okay, now we've gotten in here and it says 3 faulty control units. So you can hold to clear faults, which I would not do at this point. You're going to go into your control modules and you're going to find the ones with faults. You can see that on the top right of your screen here, there's the control module number 1, 2, 3, engine being 1, transmission being 2, brakes being 3, and they're either green or red. Red means that there are faults in there. So let's start with engine. We're going to go into the engine control module and go into faults. And it says requirement malfunction, indicator lamp on. That means nothing. It's likely related to another fault. And so, all right, here is where we have our check engine lights relating to unexpected mechanical gear disengagement. This is something that was the reason why this vehicle was actually purchased, because it has a sporadic DSG issue that if you don't stop the vehicle all the way before putting it from reverse to drive, it will have the what used to be called the Prindle display, or park reverse neutral drive, and what used to be low in this car is going to be sport. It will flash on all the gear selections, indicating there's an issue. So this is actually going to be relating to why he purchased this car. He got a crazy good deal for it, and it's a great car for the value. He purchased it for 126,000 miles. Overall, it's a nice car. There, again, we saw a few different things that need to be addressed. This issue with this unexpected mechanical gear disengagement, there's a couple things. One, because that seepage around the transmission, I would say it's either possibly related to low fluid, which we would address first, and then we can assume that there's some other mechanical issue with the DSG gearbox in this car that's causing some concerns. In this particular case, the issues that are happening are not particularly terrible, as in the vehicle won't drive. So you could easily just continue to drive the vehicle as is, assuming you get it inspected. Radio tuner, there's faults. That's pretty normal. Generally, there's almost always faults in there. And going into this control module is painful because, all right, tuner not enabled. So oftentimes when you scan a radio, there'll actually be a noise that comes over the speakers. It's terribly unpleasant, and I prefer to not listen to it if you ever have to. It will pop on while you're scanning all the control modules. So as we can see here, this car is actually much cleaner than I would have expected for 126,000 miles. Very few faults. Really, the engine one's relating to the transmission one, and the radio one is not even a relevant fault. So the only major fault we have with this car is going to be with the DSG issue, which was known when this car was purchased. Okay, so let's real briefly recap what we have going on with this car. First, before we get into that, let me just say all the things that we're going to be talking about, all the parts we're relating to replacing, we will have links in the description below, as well as videos that we have relating to that and articles explaining the concerns around that particular item. With this vehicle, the recap would be we had the issues that we knew were relating to the DSG problems. That was something that was no surprise when we found those faults in the transmission control module. It was the reason why this vehicle was purchased. In regards to the other problems, 126,000 miles, there were a few things that we found along the way. Let's go down the list. We have our water pump. We knew we found that leaking underneath. We did confirm that we did have a low coolant level, which makes sense given the coolant leak we had. We have an oil leak coming from somewhere underneath the vehicle. It was on the passenger side outer of the engine. There's a timing cover in that section, which is likely relating to. This vehicle will be getting a timing chain tensioner and potentially a chain update, depending on if we find chain stretch on this particular vehicle. More will be to come on that. And then we went to having a tie rod end on the driver's side outer that needs to be replaced, 2 CV boots, and then front pads. Now, again, going through that list, it may seem like a lot for somebody. With a vehicle of this age, 126,000 miles on it, being a private party sale, again, you're not purchasing it from a dealership or a used car lot or anything like that, which means there wouldn't have been any inspection before the car went for sale. That doesn't seem like a terribly a lot to me. I understand that probably may not make sense for everybody, but I wouldn't expect any car with 126,000 miles, unless it was being sold by a lot, to be problem-free as far as anything that you could find. Now, none of these things are majorly urgent and can potentially become more urgent if they were to get worse, but none of them immediately are a problem, which means you could continue to drive this car without any concerns. You would have to keep an eye on all those things that you found along the way. Hopefully you found this video helpful. If you like this video, be sure to give a thumbs up and subscribe for more like it.